Good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you to this very long-awaited event. I want to start by welcoming you to the forum and also to this event that's aiming to discuss journalism, democracy, and the profound ways in which both of these can be affected and shaped by generative AI. My name is Wafaa El-Sadr. I'm the Executive Vice President for Columbia Global and also the Director of Columbia World Projects. I'm just going to take a minute to tell you a bit about Columbia World Projects, the organizer of the event today. So CWP, as we call Columbia World Projects, was established by President Emeritus Bollinger, sitting here, with the goal of aiming to advance knowledge and action in relation to humanity's most complex challenges. And in many ways, CWP reflects a very deeply rooted commitment at Columbia to research, to education, and to service, and very importantly, to social impact, what President Bollinger called our fourth purpose. So we truly believe that CWP offers a home for social impact work, and particularly for the fourth purpose for the university. Now, today's event reflects this ethos to always bring together researchers and practitioners from very diverse disciplines, diverse backgrounds and experiences, and from different communities and countries, in order to deepen our understanding and advance our thinking on the challenges that we face as a global community. I'd like to mention a couple of things and then hand it over to our moderator. I'd like to mention first that as part of the work, we are also proud to collaborate with the School of International Affairs and Public Affairs, SIPA, here at Columbia, on their Saving Journalism conference series. I would also be remiss if I did not mention that this evening event is supported by the Bolinger Convenings. This is a program which sits in the Provost's office here at Columbia and aims to showcase innovative initiatives that create societal impact and advance human welfare. So this is one of those convenings that we've had at the university through this program. So now it's my deep pleasure to welcome Anya Schiffrin, who is a senior lecturer at SIPA and director of the school's Technology, Media, and Communication specialization at the school, who will introduce the stellar group of speakers that you'll be hearing from tonight. Thank you very much. It's great to have you all here.
Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. My name's Anya Schiffrin, and I am the Director of the Technology, Media, and Communications specialization at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. I first want to thank our dean for showing up, Karen Yarhumilo, so supportive, really appreciate that. I've been teaching a class called Global Media for nearly 20 years. And during the pandemic, it became clear that we had to start looking for solutions. So my students and I started writing these reports. We were funded by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, called Saving Journalism. And we looked around the world and we were so inspired because we saw solutions in all the places that you wouldn't even expect, like Indonesia, Tunisia, South Africa, Lebanon. And we finished this report, and since we're academics, we said, we need to share this. And it was right after the pandemic. It was April 2020. And we started writing to people all over the world saying, would you like to come? And we started as a small group of 30 people. Our partner and funder for years since the beginning is Taylor Owen for the Center of Media Technology and Democracy at McGill at Max Bell School of Public Policy, and natural partner for us. And people came and were so excited. Andrea Pratt, we worked across the university. And the rule of saving journalism is anybody who wants to come is welcome. And we started, then we met Columbia World Projects, and we started doing Zooms with regulators, bringing Brazilians and South Africans together and Europeans, saying, how can we regulate big tech? How can we protect journalism? Well, here's Lee Bollinger. Thank you, Lee. I don't think we've ever been on a panel together. When Lee was the president of Colombia, he was known worldwide for his support of free speech and democracy. Thanks to Lee, we have the Knight Center on the First Amendment, we have the Tao Center, we have the Brown Center, we have the Free Expression Initiative that Holly Johnson has more or less been running single-handedly for years now. And being Colombia, of course, we're like, wait a minute, why aren't we all in the same room? Why aren't we all working together? But it doesn't matter because we're all friends and we collaborate. So when I saw that there was a grant for a Bollinger convening, $17,000, I was like, this is perfect. This is exactly what we do. So I applied, and I couldn't believe it when I got the email that said, you have got this grant. And they said, hey, do a big public event and just invite everybody. So here we all are. And I said, I can definitely think of a lot of people who really care about this topic. So you're all in the room. And this is the opening ceremony of Saving Journalism, which will happen for the next few days. From the beginning, pretty much, as well as Taylor, I have to thank Anna Marchese and Tom Asher. And my joke about Anna is in a university full of people that love each other and help each other, Anna is the most competent person I've ever met in this campus, and that is saying a lot. So thank you, Anna, and thank you, Tom, and thank you, Ira. And I want to thank also the Provost's office and Andrew Perlmutter and Samuel Siap, because all along, everyone has been terrific. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we're going to plunge right in. So Lee Bollinger, as you all know, President Emeritus, Seth Lowe Professor, leading First Amendment scholar. Melissa Fleming and I actually met at a conference in Alpbach. We do a lot of panels together, so I'm glad to see you here. Melissa is the Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the UN. And one of the things that first made me want to meet you was reading your incredible book about a Syrian refugee family. Honestly, I stayed up all night to read it, in fact. Churchill, Otieno, and I have been collaborating. Many of you know our work on African journalism. Churchill is the chair of the African Editors Forum, which includes 32 outlets on the continent. We've been in multiple meetings together, and we're working now on some of these questions around collective negotiations and getting big tech to pay for news. Katrín, Jakobsdottir, when we met, you were the Prime Minister of Iceland, and a small Columbia tidbit, the former Minister of Culture was actually a CEPAS alum. So she's come to Saving Journalism, and we've been there to present some of our work, and, you know, Joe said we have to get Katrín. Last but not least, my husband, the Nobel laureate, Joseph E. Stiglitz, the economist, and what you might not know is I met him interviewing him for a Columbia homework assignment. So he was at Stanford, and I said, no, I'm not moving to Palo Alto, you better come here. So I think Joe's really happy he moved to New York, and we're really delighted. Do your homework, folks. It's worth it. So obviously, I have a million questions, but then as I was thinking about this, I thought, really, we need to talk about the elections straight away. And the first person to ask about elections is our former Prime Minister, Katrín. And can you talk to us a little bit how you've seen sort of social media and now AI sort of transform elections?
Hi, great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Of course, everybody's thinking about elections here in the US. Actually, in Iceland, everybody is thinking about elections too, because there was actually a call for snap election at the end of November. Personally, I can tell you I have been through 8 elections. I began my political career in 2002 when I ran for the local council in Reykjavik. I had 6 parliamentary elections and 1 presidential election this spring. And there has been a complete transformation of political debate through new technologies. When I entered parliament in 2007, there wasn't even a Facebook. I remember entering there and saying to myself and my husband, maybe this is going to be used in political debate. Let's see what happens. Well, I think it's fair to say that in the elections that came after that in 2009 and 2013, Facebook was the main platform for political debate in Iceland. Then we had Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and I think TikTok is now actually the social media that was most dominant in the last presidential election. And that was interesting because I really didn't feel like entering TikTok, but I can see now that in this snap election in Iceland, everybody is on TikTok. And what I can see is that political debate is beginning to revolve more about entertainment. And we have seen at the same time the role of traditional media changing, more to begin with what I could call one-man media, where there isn't really any journalism going on, where the distinction between opinions and journalism become very bland. And now we're actually experiencing what you've been working on, which is really analyzing generative AI and journalism, because what we have been experiencing in Iceland are the bots that are used to really enter the social media and turn the discussion. And I have some interesting stories to tell, not least from the presidential election, where I really felt that a rabbit hole was opened in front of me. One small example, because I won't talk all the time, but for example, I had been collaborating with WHO on issues concerning well-being, and this was made highly suspicious in social media, even though it was just work on well-being, which was one of my main political agendas during my time as Prime Minister. But then I was working for a foreign entity, which was the World Health Organization. This is a complete change in debate in Icelandic politics, and I don't think we have seen the last of that. But there are also some solutions, because you want to talk about solutions, and I will come to them later.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think, Churchill, you've been saying that elections on the continent have been very affected by social media and also generative AI. What are you seeing?
Thank you, Anya, for having me, and great to be here this evening. I've been at the center of, I would say, 7 elections now in terms of editorial leadership, mostly for the National Media Group in Kenya. And I could say that with each successive election, we've seen the ever-emerging centrality of social media, especially when it comes to the discourse around campaigns, but more critically when it comes to reporting the result, the outcome of that election. The most recent one was just 2 years ago in 2022, and it was very, very clear that all the campaigns had prepared themselves, both in terms of messaging, but also in terms of resourcing. Resourcing to the extent that they brought in international experts to help them shape, frame, and prepare what messages to put out. They brought in experts from India, from Europe, and some from the US, who knew exactly how to use the social media platforms that were mostly used in Kenya at that point in time, which then was Facebook, and to some extent, WhatsApp. And what became very, very clear to the editors in Kenya is that for the average voter, for the public, if a message is well-shaped, professionally designed, chances that they believe that message rises exponentially, regardless of the source. Some of the people who are able to get hooked into basically false information tended to be fairly sophisticated professionals, very, very well exposed, well-traveled, but still they were unable to see sometimes very telling giveaways on some of these messages. And out of discussions that we've now had as the African Editors Forum, is that reality is not just in Kenya. It holds true for Nigeria. It holds true for South Africa that had just come out of an election, that whenever it comes to a contestation as to truth versus the non-truths, there are means available to anybody with money today to try and basically social engineer their followers and the electorate into believing what they have. So what we've until recently seen as developments in terms of information technology has ended up basically enabling those who are well-resourced and therefore have the biggest megaphone to decide their own truths and try to force that and sometimes persuade huge chunks of population into believing that those truths is the reality. Why this is a big issue is that in most of these contexts, the electoral managers, the people who by law should be the ones coming with the real result, many times are woefully unprepared and woefully incapable in terms of processing that result and delivering it at a time when it's, that it can compete with what's coming out of social media. Such that by the time the Electoral Commission in most of these countries arrive with the result, the conversation has long moved on, and in many of the camps, celebrations are already going on. So you find that once that happens, it doesn't matter what the true result is. In fact, many times, if that result does not align with what social media is saying, we end up with social disharmony and sometimes violence. And we've seen that in fairly little terms. Thanks.
Churchill, I think you're making us all worry about what's going to happen here in November. I think maybe a little bit of optimism could be from, we'll all have to read Andrea Pratt's new paper written with Andrei Simonov about how people can actually, Angelucci, can actually distinguish false and true information. But what you're describing is very worrisome, and I do think a bit familiar. And I feel like, Melissa, you're sort of living this all over the world. And what's the UN doing about all this?
Yeah, well,
These
thanks.
big problems of truth.
Thanks, Anya, and thanks so much for convening us all and being such a pioneer. Because from our perspective, there are very few academic institutions that are pulling everybody together in this ecosystem that has had to spring up all over the world to address this information ecosystem that has become so damaging and toxic, because the platforms themselves are not doing anything about it. So what we at the UN have discovered is that every single area of our work is negatively affected by mis and disinformation and hate speech that is algorithmically favored over content that is well-researched, good and credible journalism, facts. And this has had, an alarming effect. In some places, it's much more obvious, like in the theater of war and peace, where, the fog of war is just so much foggier, but also where bad actors are using information as weapons as well, and with social media are able to cause much more damage than they were before. I mean, you think about the Rwanda radio station. This is now, first of all, coming from a completely different country, and is free, and is a tool that is that can be deployed also in a way that doesn't leave many fingerprints. Number one, if you're interested in climate change, we thought we had, and we do have, consensus that climate change exists. But if you go on Twitter or X on any given day, you might see the hashtag climate scam trending. And since Elon Musk took over the platform, he let back in all of the banned accounts. So we're finding ourselves scrambling in a way to going back where we were several years ago, trying to just establish, yes, climate change is real. And this is exhausting because we had already come so far. And then there are things that you can do about it. And then actually, it makes sense. Every single area of our work, not to mention elections around the world. So and we can get into it a little bit more, we had to act. I lead communications at the UN, and we also have a big information operation. We run UN News. We have social media platforms that have millions of followers. But we, for example, as the UN, are downranked on meta platforms. So that means that our starting point in trying to circulate information that we think people should see or would like to see is much less likely to be seen than the content of that of an individual. So we're in a constant struggle. We're trying to up our game, but at the same time, and maybe we can get into this a bit later, we have also worked on policy documents that we believe offer a blueprint for a healthy information ecosystem and digital environment.
Thank you very much, Melissa. It's really fantastic what you're doing, and I know our students have really enjoyed their collaboration and capstones with your, with your parts of the UN and other parts as well. Joe, you just published a book on freedom, and you talk
good publicity. Oh, buy it. Yeah.
as well as you talk about, you have a little bit on social media in there, but you've also written about the marketplace of ideas and asymmetric information, and that I guess for me the headline from the book is the old Isaiah Berlin, freedom for the wolf can mean death to the sheep. So I'm wondering, how do you think about this whole problem of mis and disinformation and these platforms that are out of control? Should they all be, was that judge right? Should we just split up Google? Or where, as an economist, where do you see some solutions?
Well, there are a whole series of problems. One we've already talked about, which is the mis and disinformation, which has, in various contexts, enormous social costs. Election we talked about. During the pandemic, the anti-vax, it can result in people dying. So, one of the issues facing all our democratic society is, when do you restrict what people can say? And there's no such thing as really First Amendment absolutism. I think Lee can talk about that more. But we say you can't cry fire in a crowded theater.
Falsely.
Falsely? Oh,
Falsely.
Is that, okay. Wait, we say it correctly?
No, you can't yell fire falsely in a crowd.
Oh, falsely. Okay.
Excellent.
And child pornography, there are restrictions. And my view is that, one person's freedom can take away that of another. And economists call it externalities, but in an integrated society, we have to be sensitive to how what we do affects others. And you can talk about masks, vaccines, guns, almost everything in our society, traffic. So this is one arena where there can be very adverse costs of mis and disinformation. On the other hand, regulating it is also very difficult and has its costs. One of the things that happened in 1995 or 6, when I had nothing to do with it. I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, but this was an issue that was never discussed inside the White House, but as part of a legislation that was called Childhood Indecency, and of course, who could object to restricting that? There was a provision called Section 230, which restricts, which said that the new social media would have no liability, effectively no accountability for what they did. And that created a culture of no accountability. And that, gave them the sense that anything goes. And some of you may remember Elizabeth Warren questioning Mark Zuckerberg, and saying, is there anything that you could say that we should not allow you to say and disseminate. And he basically said no, he could say anything with any consequence. And that that should be, a politician could say anything and that could be disseminated without restrictions. Now, there's always been false statements, big lies. These are things that we've talked about. But the new technology has changed the consequences of this in a very important way. So while the new technologies, you might have thought we ought to have become more careful about, we should be more concerned about virality. There wasn't virality before. Now, the way the legal system worked was made them less accountable rather than more accountable. So whereas we should have adjusted things one way, we did it the other way. One of the things, you know, one of the issues here we're talking about is elections and democracy. When Twitter first started, the guys who founded Twitter thought it was going to democratize the whole ecosystem, informational ecosystem. And it wasn't much later when it was recognized that most of the accounts, most of the people are bots and not people. And that meant if you had more money, you became more vocal. And they weren't taking down the bots and they weren't taking down the false information. So in fact, money, in some sense, de-democratized. It meant money was more important than before, and we're seeing in this election, an election, I mean, I'm sure your elections aren't in the billions and billions in Iceland, I mean, the amount of money, but that really undermines the functioning of democracy. There's one more point I'll just make, which, because one of the other aspects, which is really related to the title, Saving Journalism, is that Google and Meta and even worse, OpenAI are scraping information from the legacy media, stealing that information without compensating it. And that means the incentive, the economics of the legacy media of gathering information has changed. And so the other aspect of it is that the legacy media, which used to perform, or continues to perform a very important role as part of our system of checks and balances of scrutiny, their business model has been undermined. And we have laws about intellectual property, but Google and OpenAI and Perplexity have basically treated those as if they didn't exist. And you may have been following, there was just a suit by Dow Jones against Perplexity. There was a $1 billion suit by New York Times against OpenAI, but we don't know where those are going to go. But it has dramatically changed the economics of the legacy media, and that has reduced the power of one of the important checks against mis and disinformation, which is the traditional media.
Thank you for such an eloquent articulation of something that many of us have been working on for several years now, and a topic that we'll be talking about in great deal tomorrow during our Saving Journalism meeting. And I also want to say, just going back to Lee, during the pandemic, you know, we were sitting around watching Zoom, and I really think that in the Columbia, in many ways, the pandemic was such a scary time, and Columbia did such a good job in so many ways. We moved to Zoom really quickly. We had, great communication. One of my colleagues, who's a scientist, brought in her air safety tester just to check that our classrooms were safe, and found they were. And, Zoom was such an important part of our life. And I remember Joe and I sitting there watching a Zoom that you were on about the First Amendment and free speech. And you said that your views had really evolved and that you were thinking, more perhaps pro-regulation than you had been. And I was so surprised. I thought, Lee Bollinger's pro-regulation? This can't be. And so I actually emailed you and said, did I hear you correctly? And you were kind enough to reply. So I'd love to hear just how is all of this generative AI, all the misinformation, the deepfakes, the deepfake pornography, which one of our PhD students is writing her dissertation on. We were just emailing about it this morning. How is it making you think about free speech and the First Amendment? How are your ideas changing or not?
So I'm here in large part just out of respect and regard for Anya, and I really appreciate what you do, Anya. Here's how I think I would pose the question. For the past 100 years, there has been a huge effort in the United States, but across the world, but I'm just going to focus on the United States now, but a huge effort to establish very strong protections for speech. And it started in 1919, and it went through World War I, censorship, the Red Scare. The beginnings of the idea of free speech were articulated, but they weren't yet implemented. It gained some momentum in the 1930s, the 1940s, but then the McCarthy era came and there was a big retrenchment on free speech. The real flowering of free speech and free press in the United States and the jurisprudence that we live by to this day, really started in the 1960s, drawing on those early cases, some of them around 1919, 1920. The expansion of free speech and free press was remarkable. False statements are protected, people's reputations can be harmed, and maybe there's a chance of some civil damages, but only if you can show that the press acted with actual malice, which is almost impossible to show. The Ku Klux Klan held a rally, a small group held a rally in 1960s, and the Supreme Court held that's protected speech. Pentagon Papers, the press gets hold of classified information, the government wants to enjoin them, and the Supreme Court says it's protected against government injunctions. Neo-Nazis won a march in a suburb of Chicago, which has a very large Jewish population and 4,000 survivors of the concentration camps, and the courts hold it's protected speech. From there, we have continued this incredible drive for the strongest protection of free speech and free press that has existed in history. I mean, there's no other country that has the degree of protection. And the agreement across political boundaries, that is, Republicans and Democrats, are pretty aligned on this one. They become very importantly different on the question of money in politics, which you raised, Joe. And importantly, there's some other differences. The question now, after this century of building up this amazing edifice of free speech and free press, is has the world changed so significantly because of the new technology of communication, of the internet and social media and so on, that whole kind of philosophy, those doctrines really need to be rethought in light of the risks to a continuing, thriving, flourishing democratic society. That is a massive question that will take really years and years to sort out. I have a colleague at the University of Chicago, Jeff Stone. I've known him since we were law clerks on the Supreme Court in 1972. We've written many books on free speech together. We did one a few years ago on this problem of social media, the internet, and whether the First Amendment jurisprudence should be changed. The views of experts from within the legal academy, within the people who study the internet, political figures and so on, the views varied from, we have arrived in a completely different world that has no resemblance to the world that existed when New York Times versus Sullivan was decided, when the Klan case called Bransenburg was decided, when the Skokie decision was decided. The world is different now. It's just too uncontrolled. It's too dangerous. And we can't continue to have the same edifice of protection. That's one view. The other view, completely, from the same quality of people, was we've seen it before. We always think things are worse than they were before. And what we need to do is just allow the principles that we've, agreed upon to play out. That is the debate. Now, where I come in on it, you have to add a dimension to the story that I just told that most people just don't know about or think about. In 1927, the Congress enacted the Radio Act. And the Radio Act set up a licensing system with extensive government regulation for radio communication. And in 1934, that became the Communications Act. Shortly, there was a fairness doctrine. There was a FCC that regulated licensees in the public interest, convenience, and necessity, a very vague term. It wasn't until 1969 that the Supreme Court considered whether broadcast regulation of content to try to make speech fair, public issues discussed, etc., was constitutional. And the Supreme Court held unanimously that broadcasting could be regulated as a new technology of communication because of characteristics about it. From the 1980s on, which Joe can talk about with great authority, the rise of the kind of free market mentality, the anti-government regulation mentality, resulted in the evisceration of regulation of broadcasting. It is a very direct analogy. It's a very complicated subject, whether there's a distinction or not between print media and broadcasting. I'm happy to explain that. It would only take me 30 minutes to do it. But it's, I think, at the end of the day, a relevant historical analogy for what we face today. But today, the primary way in which the social media companies want to portray themselves as the equivalent, the analogy of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they should have the same freedoms applied to them. My view is that the broadcasting analogy, not precisely, but close enough, offers a way to impose some form of public control of these companies. The end of the book that we published has a recommendation from a commission that Jeff and I set up, trying to use Section 230 as a lever for getting companies to agree to a public regulatory system. So that's what
Can I ask one quick follow-up? Because Yuval Harari just came out with a book, and he, on the nexus, on the history of information, one thing he says is the big problem is that the algorithm and the bots have freedom of speech. And if you just solve that, then you could solve the problem. What do you think?
It's a very good question, because what has happened is that the change is happening at such an exponential pace right now. And I mentioned that earlier, having been in politics for 20 years, it's a drastically different landscape. And I'm not sure that our brains are really wired for this change. Now you have, at least in Iceland, the young people, they have screen time from 4 hours up to 7 hours, which is maybe up to 50% of the time that they are awake. And they are getting used to, and that reminds me of what you said, Joe, because you see that people are seeking information without ever visiting real news websites. They simply use the big information that comes from the big companies, those who have the freedom of speech, as you say, Melissa. You never actually visit a real journalism website. So I think this is a key where we need to find solutions, because what is happening with this change, which is happening at such an exponential pace, is, as I said, I'm not sure that our brains are wired for it. You know, when I was growing up, you read a newspaper in the morning and watched the news in the evening. Now you can see the world just transform itself several times over one day. And everything happens so fast, and this is really I think, something that we can't turn around. You know, and I can say that, you know, in the beginning of this development, I was one of the people who said, this is what democracy is about. This is about everybody being equal in the platform of social media. This is about not having the elite directing the debate. But what we are seeing is that the debate and these discussions, they are directed. This isn't really an equal platform.
Melissa, it's interesting you mentioned the algorithm and the bots. For the man on the street, you'd think that algorithms and bots have no stake in the fight, that they come neutral. But we all know that in real sense, these are masks, and there are people and lots of interests hiding behind them. If for no other interest, we've all known that in a conversation like we're having now, if there's one of us who is more powerful, and they choose and to exercise that power in a manner that the pipeline that brings in the facts into this room is suppressed, there's a name for that kind of behavior, a name that we've all used all these years. It's known as censorship. So how is it that algorithms today can suppress news and let disinformation surface? I think there needs to be a lot more outrage about this than we are seeing.
Thank you. I wasn't sure, Melissa,
No, that was, I was just throwing in a question, and I didn't mean to take over your moderator role, but I was just wondering if Mr. Bollinger had any thoughts about whether bots or algorithms had freedom of speech, because, I mean, the case is our social media platforms actually publishers? Isn't that the fundamental question?
I mean, I think there would be a consensus across the First Amendment community that AI-generated speech is not protected. There has to be some degree of human agency close enough. And a number of people have written about this. Larry Lessig at Harvard has made the case that the generation of, quote, communication coming out of computers is too far removed from the human agency. I think the question really is, can we devise a regulatory system that helps to put pressure on the social media companies to monitor and exclude that? Because you can say it's not protected, but you still have the problem of who's going to be in charge of making sure that it doesn't spread. And that problem is very, very significant. I mean, it's really important, as I'm trying to argue while also arguing for a qualification, really important to remember that it took a century to try to get the degree of protections for speech that we enjoy and that are at risk in lots and lots of ways. It's also very important to realize that the dangers of government interventions are potentially quite serious, and we may find in the next couple of weeks that they're really serious. And so, but even with that, the great thing I think about the broadcast experience was a sort of general recognition by public officials, by policymakers, that this was posing a change in the ways in which people communicated about public issues, or even concentrated on public issues, and that required some kind of public intervention, and it was allowed. I think that's what's missing here. We really just have none.
Yeah, and I think it's worse because the people like Zuckerberg and Musk have taken extreme positions on these issues that it's clear we ought to be pushing back. An example, in Australia, there's a billionaire called Twiggy, which is a company that was selling financial products that you wouldn't want to have sold, had a fake rendition of Twiggy, who is known to be a great, entrepreneur and a multi-billionaire, telling them that he was buying these and they should go buy these products. And Twiggy was very upset that his name was being used to sell a product that he would never want to do. He told Meta that they ought to take it down, and they said no. That's not our job, and so it continued. And so he's now suing in the United States to try to have some kind of accountability for this kind of thing. Now, Anya mentioned, talking about solutions. Other countries have actually, which are trying to square the circle. Taiwan has a kind of legislation where if Facebook doesn't get permission of Twiggy, then anybody who loses money from this kind of thing has a claim against Meta. And that discourages Meta from having these. So it suggests that if you start thinking about it more deeply, you can figure out ways of holding them somewhat more accountable.
Yeah. We'll take a billionaire, but most people aren't billionaires. And imagine this billionaire can't get it taken down. And what we're getting over and over again, calls from around the world. This post is inciting violence, providing an actual address. Please take this down, and making the phone calls, calling, using the UN that does have some power to intervene, and then the person gets killed. Or in the extreme case of Myanmar that has been well documented, but maybe is not that well known, where Facebook was used by the government and religious groups to denigrate the Rohingya community and basically give license to rape and kill and drive them out of the country in the worst possible ways. So many warnings were given over months to Facebook. Nothing was done. And so what we're seeing is two things which make the whole picture so much more complicated. We're seeing a really difficult discussion in democracies and privileged countries. Then we're seeing 70% of the world that live in autocracies, where we have the other worry, which is people who are expressing themselves online are being thrown in jail. And then we have the powerless, vulnerable people who are being targeted online, but not necessarily have actually no recourse, absolutely no recourse.
Yeah.
But that's the problem that you actually mentioned there, because the EU has regulated now with the AI Act, and I can tell you that the discussion in Europe is mainly that it doesn't go far enough. And then, of course, the general data protection regulation, which has caused quite a lot of strain between Meta and the EU, because that revolves around, for example, that it's not a given that Facebook can use all the material I have placed on Facebook in their development of generative AI. So this is interesting, but because this is a transboundary issue, and because every continent and every nation is trying to preserve its competitiveness and wants to be able to make, use of AI, it's problematic. So the whole forming of regulation within the EU has been quite complicated, but at least something is being done.
So just a couple of comments. I mean, I think the problem that you raise is unbelievably acute. That is, it's just not, if you start from the premise, which I do, and many people do, I think, that the very structure of social media and the companies that control it, the very structure of it does not lead to incentives to take down and the stuff that's really horrible. I mean, you ask anybody who is an editor of a major newspaper, would you allow a candidate for public office to publish an advertisement, a political advertisement with obvious falsehoods in it? They would never allow it. I mean, the Washington Post had a policy, the New York Times has a policy of not allowing falsehoods but these companies, which are claiming to be the modern equivalent of the Washington Post and the New York Times, have no such standards and indeed have incentives for wanting to, and no journalistic culture on that. Okay, so it's not, it's not all bad, because for like 5 years when Facebook first began, we were all ecstatic at the revolutionary potential for democracy that this new technology would enable. And then for the next 5 years, we've said it's the end of the world as we know it. So there are positive things and there are these really negative things, and the structure is a problem. So then the big question is, what kind of system are we comfortable with, will end up being constitutional, will end up being effective? The group that that Jeff and I set up took the following position. Agreed with all of the things I just said, obviously, and then said, as Joe pointed out, we've given you this in Section 230 from the 1990s, this incredible freedom from any liability for anything, just about anything you publish, communicate. That's been important for the expansion of this new technology to be very powerful for good reasons. But you're now in a position where you have the benefits of that, but we've got the real costs of it. It's going to be very difficult. I mean, the First Amendment, I'll tell you, is not going to make it easy to have direct control of the media companies. So the idea that we proposed is, okay, you make Section 230 conditional. If you want to get the protections of 230, you have to agree to several things. One, you have to have real serious content moderation policies. Secondly, you have to set up with the other companies a self-regulation organization, which will then enforce that. And then there will be a public agency. We recommended a new one be established, or it could be given to the FTC, that sort of works with the SRO and then with these companies to try to implement serious content moderation. If you look at their content moderation policies, they're actually pretty good. They just don't implement them. So that's just one route to try to bypass the constitutional objections.
Can I just say one thing about, you began with a discussion about the elections. If you combine deepfakes with the ability to lie, or to say anything, then you realize that they can put out over the social media a pretense that anybody can say anything about any other candidate. So that you really muddy up the whole ability to have an intelligent discussion. You don't know what the candidates, they could have the candidate saying things, not the real candidate, but a fake of the candidate, saying things that's the opposite of what they believe. And that's where the social media are today. So to me, they do represent a real threat, and something along the lines that we put forward, and along the DSA, but much stronger, the Digital Services Act, which is the European regulatory framework, has to be brought in.
I guess I have a couple of observations in response. One is, I do think we're already in that post-truth world, and I think that, you know, the reaction to events in the Middle East is a perfect example of that. People have such different ideas of what's happening that they just can't agree in any way on the solutions. And then I think also that what we're seeing around the world is precisely, you were really talking about a collective action problem, that because the US hasn't regulated, the rest of the world is paying the price, just like they're all watching our elections to see what happens. And, you know, one of the things that we've been working on in the Saving Journalism group, and also, you know, Churchill and I have been talking about, is this question of how do you get these companies to pay for news? And it's similar to the regulation problem, which is, we have plenty of folks in the audience from Canada, you know, by dropping news distribution in Canada, Meta managed to scare regulators in Brazil and South Africa, in Australia, into standing back from trying to get payments. So I think we have a real collective action problem. And I was just wondering, Churchill, you know, when we've convened with Tom and Anna, you know, some of the African regulators here in the forum, what we're told is, we've got so many other problems. Regulating big tech is just not a top priority for us. Our businesses depend on Facebook. And, you know, good luck to you, but this is not, you know, the first thing we want to do. And I was just wondering, Churchill, if you're having those conversations as well.
Yeah, certainly. When you look at the entirety of the news ecosystem in Africa, there are lots of pressures that currently obtain. Naturally, as in the rest of the world, the whole business question, or if you like, revenue question, is a constant one. So that every publisher in Africa, every media owner in Africa is always wondering whether they're going to make payroll for that month. Yeah? And for that reason, there is this constant, almost a siege mentality around the money aspect of things. Now, with that reality, we bring in other, I could call them oddities or unique aspects of that terrain. The first one being government or state interference. That in most of those markets, the state is immensely more powerful than other states are when it comes to influencing media or journalism. One reason for it might be, it's been argued, the entitlement of the ruling class and the fact that in many instances the media owners and the rulers go to the same, you know, members clubs. So they see the world in the same sort of perspective. But the second reason, which perhaps is a lot more related, is the fact that in many of those economies, the government to date is the biggest player. So if you're running a business, one of your biggest customers, the fellow who perhaps guarantees the fattest check for your business, tends to be the public sector. So that public sector advertising, for example, has become a major source of bad influence on a general play. Third level is the whole question of power dynamics insofar as politics goes, and the reality that the ends justifies the means, such that if there's a reporter who is so passionate about their journalism that they bring in narratives that make my politics difficult. In many African countries, that reporter's life becomes fairly fair game in terms of consuming it, such that sometimes journalism has ended up leading to deaths of individuals who play that journalism. As we sit here today, there are hundreds of journalists who've had to escape their homes, their countries, because the rulers in those countries cannot live with the truth that journalism brings. And Sudan is a good example that you're looking at. So in all that makes the conversations around bargaining codes and negotiations with the big tech is important, but is not as high in the priority list as it should be. We are today trying to wake up business owners and publishers' eyes to the reality that even though it might be lower on the list, having a diversified revenue source, we can help shield them from state interference. We're trying to push them to learn how to negotiate collectively as a group with the big tech so that they have a better chance in getting better deals. It's working slowly, but we hope that it's going to move to a level where it can be a lot more realistic. Mostly given that a lot of the African countries are still further down the road in terms of how that moves. South Africa, for example, is a lot further on the road, and we think maybe Nigeria and Kenya. The rest are at a much worse situation.
Really interesting. Before, thank you, Churchill, for that. It's so interesting. I mean, when I started working on African media more than 20 years ago, I really thought there's so many lessons for the US, and so much of what we saw in Africa decades ago has come to pass here. So always really sobering. We're going to take audience questions soon. I have them all listed here. But I really wanted to just ask Katrín to tell us a little bit about what Iceland has done with OpenAI. Joe and I actually went to, and one of the reasons we went to Iceland in March, apart from the conference, was we really wanted to meet the people who've been working with the large language model. And in this question of sort of collective negotiations and collective action when dealing with the tech companies, Iceland is so small that you took a really different route. And I think it would be interesting to hear about the collaboration and the spell checks and the grammar checks and all the kind of dilemmas you faced of making sure Icelandic is preserved.
Thank you. Well, it's a good thing to be able to tell one success story in these times because, as you might know, Iceland is a very small language community. There are around 390,000 people living in Iceland. Around 18 to 19% are immigrants. So there's a large part of the population immigrants. And we have a lot of English influence, language influence, because we are highly technical. Icelanders are a little bit like that. You know, when Facebook came into being, it only took a few months, and then 95% of the Icelandic population was on Facebook. This is really how a small country works. We kind of dive into it and really do it, all of us. So what we saw with when I actually entered government as Prime Minister in 2017, I wanted to focus on language technology because what you could see was that people had started to speak English to their TV sets and other equipment, their computers, their phones. So we set out and, we began by investing a lot in infrastructure, in research in language and research in language technology. And then we formed a plan. We had a great Minister for Culture and Education and Research, a great president who was also a professor in history. Myself, I have a background in Icelandic literature. So you could say that we were really focused on this. The president and the Minister for Culture actually took a trip to Silicon Valley and visited all the high-tech companies. And what happened was a collaboration with OpenAI on making Icelandic eligible, with the participation of both the government, an Icelandic company called Miðend, and the public-private partnership in a platform that is kind of combines both the private actors and the public actors. And it was quite a learning process, and it was also a story I hope that can be used for further development, because one of the things that was actually taken into consideration was the fact that if we want to make Icelandic accessible within the world of artificial intelligence, you need a lot of material. So actually there was formal collaboration with the Writers' Union because we needed a lot of texts. There was voluntary participation of people who actually wanted to participate and really listen to how the computer was speaking and rectify it and lend their voices. So you could say it was also a crowdsourcing project. And the aim is that it's actually free to use. So Icelandic companies or public institutions that are using chatbots, for example, they can speak Icelandic, and so the companies and institutions can actually use that. Now, the chatbots often cannot answer any questions. The best conversation I have had with a chatbot was with an airline that actually the plane didn't show up, but everybody was trying to make a call and nobody answered, obviously, because the plane wasn't there and everybody was calling. And a friend of mine spoke to the chatbot, which said, told her what the name of the airport in Lisbon was and what she could do in Lisbon. And she was quite frustrated. And then the chatbot said, if you don't have anything nice to say, you should rather not say it. So sometimes artificial intelligence can be quite amusing. But this was a success story, and hopefully we can share that knowledge, because of course we met a lot of hindrances doing that project. The problem is, however, because that, even though we can use Icelandic, the material in English is so overwhelming that still, even though you can use Icelandic, a lot of the younger generation prefer to use English when they seek information. So that is another question, how we can actually make it something that you really want to use, the Icelandic language.
Yeah, it was really interesting going and meeting the people working on this, and they're sort of in very close contact with OpenAI, and they come to Silicon Valley a lot. Another tidbit was they don't wear shoes in the office. So we thought that was really charming. I was like, can I work from home in Reykjavik? This is really, really nice.
Well, we always take our shoes off when we go into houses.
I think it's very civilized. I mean, we should start that at Columbia.
In Iceland, we do that. That's typical.
But we'll talk to the dean about that. Yeah, no, super interesting. So we got loads and loads of questions. Really interesting. And I'm going to try to, pages of questions. So I'm going to group them into topic. And I think maybe I'll go first to Melissa and sort of summarize as what sort of interesting solutions have you seen around the world to problems of AI, disinformation, deepfakes, and the effect it's having on democracy? Anything you want to highlight?
Yeah, we've seen a lot more problems than solutions. I do want to emphasize that the EU Digital Services Act is making Europe and its people safer, and it is making it more difficult for the platforms not to adjust for the whole world. So that has been a positive step in regulation. We have seen, as I mentioned before, an ecosystem of academics, of fact-checking organizations, journalists who are now have disinformation as a beat. But also what we're seeing is more of a realization that, back to the subject of journalism, that we have to start thinking about media development again. It used to be this kind of term, how do we support free and independent media? But in the context of the kind of extinction event that has occurred as a result of the rise of social media, at first it was taking away the advertising and the business model just collapsing. But now it's also that what Joe mentioned, the scraping of the data, the not compensating journalists, what you, Anya, have worked so hard on, and that is people don't realize that Facebook and other social media platforms were the distribution model for so many news organizations. I mean, they were seen as a huge hope until they then just adjusted the algorithm. I think it was 2018 and said, actually, our people are more interested in friends and family, and they're not interested in news. And that's where everything sunk, including UN news. And the struggle just became worse. I do see that there is more funding and there are more organizations that are willing to bolster the traditional media as a pillar of democracy and so important in an information ecosystem. And finally, there's an area that is a solution that I think is so often overlooked, and that is how does social media make its money? And that is, it has taken all the advertising over, right? But then it has this system called programmatic advertising, which is also unregulated and very murky with all kinds of middlemen. So if you're a brand, before you used to say, I want my brand to be on, as you mentioned, Mr. Bollinger, that, in the Washington Post next to this type of article, and you could actually go and then control where it landed. Now you say, and at first it sounded kind of cool, for the same amount of money, I can land on 1,500 websites. The problem is that brand loses complete control over where their advertisement is landing. And very often it's landing either next to a disinformation actor, a misogynist, an anti-Semite, a racist, or fake newspapers that are springing up just to make money, just to earn money from this programmatic advertising scheme. And so I've seen, there's a fantastic organization, for example, called Check My Ads. They'd spend every single day with an army of people screenshotting and then calling up Tide or Hertz and saying, did you know your ad was placed? And actually have managed to defund a lot of these disinformation websites. So there is some hope. I could go on. If I could just say that I'm quite proud of the UN's global principles on information integrity that is now being used by a number of countries and stakeholders, and even some staff members of social media companies have come up to me and said, don't say it was me, but thank you for doing this because it helps us to hold our employers to account. So it is a blueprint, and there are lots of recommendations for the platforms, for advertisers, for states, for media, and I think it in some way hopefully will move the needle.
So Melissa, can I ask you a question? You often hear the slogan that the U.S. innovates, China imitates, and Europe regulates. And how do you answer that?
How would you answer it? I would. I mean, the innovation was considered the social media platforms, and the rest of the world. You were right to say that there was tons of excitement. We at the UN were really excited because we didn't only have to deliver our information via journalists. We could, speak to people directly until the dark side started appearing. I mean, there are some governments where U.S. social media platforms can't even be seen in some countries. And then they have their own forms of social media and media, which are completely controlled. So, yeah, it's a longer answer. But
coming from Europe, which regulates, but as you said, Melissa, it's regulation to protect the citizens in democratic countries. So I personally think, you are often very frustrated as a politician because of You know, Iceland is not a member of the EU, but we implement a lot of its regulation. And it is quite important. I mentioned the general data protection regulation, which everybody thought was just so frustrating, but it is important because personal information is valuable data.
Yeah.
So
My answer is partly that not all innovation is welfare increasing. You could have innovation to increase monopoly power. So the regulatory framework that is designed to make sure that the innovation is welfare increasing is an absolutely essential part of a well-functioning society. Yeah, let me stop. Yeah.
Audience questions.
Yeah, in terms of solutions, I think two things stand out for me. One is that those whose duty is to deliver content to the public must be recognized and categorized as such, and then they must play by the same rules. That sometimes has invited some school of thought that perhaps it's time to innovate around how to regulate media. And some have even said we should elevate that from media regulation into thinking about more of media governance. And the idea there is that we force those who are insisting on standing outside the fence to come inside the fence and use what academics have perfected over time, which is peer review. You know, by bringing them in the fence, we find ways in which we put everybody under check. The second dimension for solutions in terms of journalism is that we must, of necessity, diversify how we fund journalism. Advertising is, I think, for the most part, is gone. I don't think it's ever gonna come back in the way that media has always known it. But we must find other ways in which we can fund journalism. Two of them stand out, and one is really speaks to my heart because it's aligned to what journalism at the core does. The best journalism many times goes after wastage of public resources in the name of investigative journalism that sometimes end in recoveries of monies that otherwise would have been lost by the public. The Africa Editors Forum holds strongly that a portion of such recoveries should be reinvested in supporting investigative journalism, and that in that alone, a lot of the weight will be lifted. The second limb of that is that if indeed we hold it as true that our democracies require a certain level of quality information to grow, then as part of the social development work that the world invests in, journalism should get support from that too. Thank you.
Churchill, that's a very interesting idea and something that a bunch of us, even in my class actually, did research on a few years ago. Drew Sullivan, there have been periodic suggestions that just like, whistleblowers might get some kind of reward, that when journalists reporting on something like tax avoidance or corruption leads to recovery of funds, journalists should get a share of that. So that's an idea that's come up and we've looked at. So I'm glad to see it's being considered again. Obviously, Andrea Pratt, James Hamilton, there's a whole strand of work now in economics, some of it which we've been a little bit involved in at SEPA on sort of how do you value news. So Churchill, in fact, you've answered a lot of the questions that came in because we had many questions, probably most of the questions were about journalism business models, how do we support local news, what is AI going to do for journalism, for journalism.
Can I add one thing
I would love
on
it.
that?
And I was going to ask you a question.
Because I think journalism faces the same challenges as the creative industries when it comes to AI. And what we have seen there is really the importance of solidarity between different artists and artists' unions. And I think when you think about media, you need stronger collaboration and more solidarity Because in the end, you know, and I'm going to be a little hopeful, you know, we like to read stories about other human beings, and I'm not sure that AI is going to produce those stories, really. We want to go in depth into understanding what's happening to people around the world. And I think this is something that real journalism can actually provide and add. Just as, you know, I've written one crime novel with another author, and I think a lot, you know, it's probably very easy to have an AI-written crime novel. I can't imagine. But you want to get to know the author. You want to understand why he or she wrote that book. So I think we can also be a little hopeful on that.
I was actually just talking to someone in Silicon Valley recently who does a lot of tech investment, and he was saying that now, you know, the quality of the sort of AI art and AI writing is so mediocre and so kind of blunt, you know, don't use it for your papers, please. It's just not there. That personal contact, personal relationships, personal experiences will become more and more valuable. Well, clearly we all think that because we're all in a room together. We're not on Zoom. Another set of questions, including from Courtney Radge and Ika and a bunch of people, and I'm not sure who wants to take this, whether it's Katrina or Joe or who, but is AI compatible with democracy given that it's opaque and lacks transparency, is unaccountable, and threatens to undermine core institutions like journalism? That came from Courtney Radge, who's the director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty at the Open Markets Institute.
Well, as you have heard, I believe AI should be regulated like other sectors of society. I think that is obvious because democracies demand transparency. They demand, you know, that we all play on the same level playing field. And while it's not regulated in some sense, and we can discuss how that regulation should be, and as I told you, the AI Act is being discussed everywhere in Europe, but we need to be very clear about that. At least I want to be absolutely clear about that the AI business needs to follow ethical guidelines, needs to have human rights as a core value in its governance, and therefore we need some regulation.
Yeah, an interesting question is whether we can use AI to regulate AI. The fact is, you know, one of the problems that in the, you know, not that long ago, social media, we were concerned about discrimination, implicit discrimination in the social media. And we had meetings like at Meta, and they would say things like, the algorithm is always changing, and there's no way we can ascertain whether there's discrimination. We always thought that was a little bit of a self-serving argument, and that there were ways of looking at a snapshot. You know, the algorithms are always changing, but you can still see the effect. You could test it in a variety of ways.
They direct the algorithm.
And they direct the, you know, and they intervene in the algorithm. But part of the problem is, are they intervening enough given the kind of data, and they're absorbing data, much of which has already built in discrimination, so they're reflecting what the data they're getting. So one of the interesting questions is, as we get more sophisticated in AI, it should be possible for them to be able to start detecting it better. But then the question is, it goes back to this human agency, will the companies like Meta, recognizing that they're being monitored, actually try to get more sophisticated ways of using AI to make it more difficult for AI to detect that they are in fact engaged, have a discriminatory bias. And I don't know where this war is going to end, but I think it's an interesting issue that we ought to be thinking about.
Well, I think, you know, when you look, you know, the first time I understood how algorithms work was when I Googled human it was shown to me actually, Google Human, it was in 2017, and all the pictures that came up were of white men, most of them more than middle-aged, and most of them were actually Donald Trump. So that was some inbuilt bias there. And what you see, because we're using AI, for example, to diagnose diseases, is that they build their data more on white men. They have more extensive data sets. And this is a big issue for people of other racial origins, and this is a big issue for women.
And discrimination. Last time I had a mammogram, I got an email from the doctor, automated. Would you like AI to look at your results? If yes, it's an extra $80. Yeah, how about that? So
I actually know an 87-year-old woman who diagnosed herself with being in menopause, you know, through AI. And then she went to the doctor who said, well, I don't think that's possible in your age.
Oh, God.
It's not a very, it's not
So
actually
it's not yet
quite reliable.
Yeah. So I know I'm supposed to give closing remarks, but I really want to make sure I ask Lee a question, which is all on our mind. It's been obviously the last year has been quite the year on campus. And I would like to know what you're thinking about free speech on campus these days. And what's so interesting is no one put it in the questions. So I'm doing it for you. The role of the journalist, ask the question everyone wants to know.
So I want to pick up on some points that were made earlier. Actually, the point about advertisers really does fit into a really interesting idea about how to bring pressure, public pressure on social media platforms by revealing that advertisers are having their advertisements next to hate speech and so on. I have taken the position, which I will continue to abide by, that I will not critique the decisions of the university over the past year or beyond. It's just not my role, and so on. But on the other hand, I have views about free speech in universities and so on, and I'm speaking about those, and we'll do so in Boston on Saturday with the new book I have coming out, and with Cass Sunstein, who has a book you really should pick up on free speech on campus. I mean, it's really a very specific and very intelligent sort of depiction of how free speech works on campus, should work on campuses. Okay, I'll say these things. First of all, the First Amendment does not apply to private universities. I think everybody basically knows that. The First Amendment only governs state action, like other constitutional provisions. And Columbia, for purposes of the concept of state action, is not a state, even though it receives federal money and blah, blah, blah. But for First Amendment purposes, Columbia can do what it would like to do with respect to speech. I often, when president, wanted to ban a lot of speech and could have gotten away with it under the First Amendment, but I could not have gotten away with it for other reasons. University of North Carolina, Berkeley, University of Michigan, they're public universities. They are bound by the First Amendment. Okay. Second big point is that every private university, basically across the country, major universities, have said for decades, we will voluntarily structure free speech on the campus about public issues according to the First Amendment. That has been the choice of Columbia, that's been the choice of Harvard, of Stanford, of Chicago, and so on. First Amendment has been the guide for debate about public issues on the campus. I am not talking about in the classroom, and I am not talking about scholarship. Obviously, the two great missions of the university. There we have very different rules, lots of restrictions on speech and what can be said and so on and so on. I'm talking really about the choice to have a public forum on the campus where faculty and students choose to speak about public issues, and there's a long tradition, as we know, in the United States and abroad of students, especially on campuses, expressing very strong views about public issues. Third point is that if you're going to live by this, you do have to do what I said at the very beginning of my comments. The building of First Amendment jurisprudence over the past century has been the fight for protection of speech, and that has gone so far that no speech can be prohibited until the moment when advocacy of violence or illegality is just about to occur. So horrible speech is protected under the First Amendment, really bad ideas, bad speech, and they're very harmful. I mean, nobody who thinks about free speech should ever accept the idea that words cannot hurt, etc. Words, ideas, etc., and so on are very, very harmful, and yet we have chosen to protect them. The reasons for that are multiple, they're complex, I can give them, but there's not time. That means that on a university campus, if you're going to abide by this, you do have to accept that very bad things are going to be said and things that will make you feel uncomfortable or offended or threatened and the like. It is the obligation of a university, in my view, to explain this and to give the reasons for it and to give the values at stake. Because everybody gets confused about it. I often say free speech is not intuitive. It is counterintuitive. We are not born believing in free speech. We have to learn how to do that. It's all against our impulses. Our impulses are to be intolerant and not to agree to free speech. So you need to educate always your community about what free speech means, about why we've adopted it, about the parameters of it. But then two final comments. I mean, I think the second is you can choose to change this if you don't like that system. It's completely open, and rational people can come to very different views. A wonderful person who teaches First Amendment at Yale has taken a very strong position that there's no need to have big public debates about public issues on campuses. We're really about scholarship and teaching, and all that other stuff of debating public issues should take place outside the university campus. Why should we have to endure that? Other people, including me, take the position that we should live by the First Amendment just like everybody else in the society has to live by the First Amendment. And indeed, we should set an example for the rest of the society about how to do this. However, again, you can decide as a private university, we would like a different system. I was with a dinner the other night with someone who said, my view is that we are a humanistic institution and we should never allow speech that is inconsistent with that value. Okay, I mean, that's a wonderful debate to have, and a university that's worth its salt should have that debate periodically. And the last thing I'd say is that, okay, I've said everything there is to say about First Amendment and as it applies to free speech on campus. The big question is always, how is discourse carried out within the parameters of free speech? And who are the leaders and how do they lead and how do we set up dialogue and conversations and debates and so on? And that requires a lot more, it's a lot more complex matter than my telling you what the kind of limits of free speech are. So those are my views.
Thank you so much. We've been thinking, since you stepped down, we've all been thinking, wow, what would Lee have thought and said? You have a new book of collected speeches and writing coming out in a couple of weeks, so hopefully there'll be more of your work. But honestly, the historical perspective, the knowledge. I remember when I came as a Badgett Fellow, taking a course at the journalism school with James Carey on the First Amendment and the lectures from Anthony Lewis. I mean, they were just really remarkable. So you never worked with me while you were here. Obviously, I was never on a panel with you. You were far too busy, but I just want to make sure you understand that your legacy is really living in the work that we're doing now with many of our students. And I can't resist closing without mentioning that Tom and Anna and I are doing a small convening in November on the legacy of Clyde Miller, who started possibly the first media literacy program in the world, certainly in the United States, in the 1930s. And he worked at Columbia Teachers College, and he believed, people were very worried about propaganda in the 1930s, just like they're worried about mis and disinformation today, and with the rise of fascism, and all, he started a Institute for Propaganda Analysis at Columbia Teachers College, and sociologists and communication scholars got together and printed up pamphlets for school teachers and had a newsletter, and every month they would analyze something in the news and talk about the pros and cons of the coverage and what the sources were. So very similar to today's media literacy. And unfortunately, as we got closer, the DICE committee got set up, we got closer to World War II, McCarthyism, they were fired by Columbia University. And during the pandemic, just like today, there's this backlash against disinformation researchers, and that group was very involved in anti-racist education. And there was a backlash against that as well, just as we're seeing today. So during the pandemic, I got very interested, and my researcher from Barnard, Chloe Oldham, and I looked at about 20 different archives to sort of unearth this historical debate at Columbia. And later on, I was in Butler, and I found a letter from Clyde Miller asking the president for his apartment back. And I thought, that is so Columbia. So I immediately took a picture and sent it to Lee. So a long-winded way of saying we have a long tradition engaging with these subjects. Thank you so much for the Bollinger convening grant. Thank you to Columbia World Projects, to SEPA, and to everybody in this room for coming. All the best.